Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this little study. I hope that and pray that it's an encouragement to you. Some interesting, beautiful things from the Word of God this morning. And again, I'm just so appreciative that you are finding this valuable and pray that God will richly, richly bless you as you venture into studying the Word of God. So, with that, we're going to start sharing the screen. Okay, well, our lesson today, just a continuation that we're going on 1 Samuel chapter 13, and we left off at verse 7 last week, kind of on a cliffhanger here, as we see that Saul is getting one of his first experiences as being king, and his first test, if you will. And so we're going to look and see what the Bible says about how he fared on his first test. So obviously, there's a scenario set up here where Samuel had given Saul some instructions. And while the instructions are not clear, we do see that there was a time period of waiting. So it says in verse 8, as you follow along, remember we're reading from Bible Hub. This is showing a Hebrew interlinear, which means it reads from right to left. And so, again, these are translations of the Hebrew, kind of phrased a little bit to make sense for us English speaking people. But it does allow you to, again, do the word searches in the Hebrew study, which is what the whole goal of this session and this teaching is all about, is to um, just show you how accessible this is, and the beauty and the depth of the Hebrew language that we have at our fingertips, close as your computer. And so let's dive in here. It says that he waited 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had told him. So the key word here is set time. We're just going to take a look at this word. We think we know what it means. Um, this is a part of speech where it has a preposition. It has the lamed preposition with a to. The mem can sometimes be known as a from, but the real preposition here is the lamed, meaning to something. So we open up this Bible Hub and we get the male. So it's a mem vav ayin dalit root, and it just means an appointed time or appointed place, which shows here is in the NASB translation. This word showed up many, many times, and it was translated into English all of these numerous times. Appointed, but it has the appointed. It has a fixed time. It has a measure to it. So with that, we're going to go back to the verse itself. And so there's a measure of time to the measure of time. So obviously Samuel had given Saul an instruction and had given him this period of time that he needed to wait. And it looked like he was waiting 7 days. Now, this was what Samuel told him. So it's kind of interesting that 7 days has passed and Samuel did not come as Saul had been promised. And so this sets up just a very, very interesting exchange here of looking at timing, looking at what we have been told, maybe the way we understand how things should come to pass, and that timing for our timing is not always God's timing, even though, um, as in this case, a person may feel that they have a clear direction, a clear word from God, or a man from God on what they should do and the timing it should take place. We're about to see here that this is not something that we can measure the way we are used to measuring. that when it comes to timing, our timing versus God's timing, that I believe this is telling us that we need to be flexible, that we cannot um, use timing as a tool to measure whether God is active, whether God is speaking, whether God's promises have come to pass or not come to pass. That a measurement of time, at least what we're going to derive from from this study here today, we have to be careful when we start relying on timing. And again, we're going to see this come to pass. And so keep that thought in mind. So there is a set time that Samuel had given to Saul, that he was going to be there and come to Gilgal. And Saul Samuel was late, and Saul was starting to get worried. The people were starting to get worried. Remember, this was a battle coming up. This was a life or death situation that Saul was going to lead his first battle as king. He was going to um, be, used by God to deliver, and the enemy was there. And if he didn't come through, loss of life could be great. Loss of country, devastation, so much coming into this that could be happening, and this was all weighing very heavy on the mind of Saul. And also, we see that the people were also getting very nervous. We read last week that many of them deserted him. And so this desertion continues in verse 8, that the people scattered. And what happened to be thousands of people are dwindling away. And we're going to see at the end here that he only had about 600 left when this finally finished out. So the people were scattering, and Saul's feeling the pressure, and Saul is, the people are wanting Saul to do something, take charge. You're the king. Do what needs to be done. We don't know where Samuel is, and we need you to be a leader. So all these things that you can imagine, we're going through the situation here, that we're pressuring Saul. And finally, Saul capitulated. He gave in. And what appears to have happened here, the scenario that was set up, is that before they could go into battle, they needed to call upon the name of the Lord. They needed to entreat God with a sacrifice and a burnt offering. And thereby, they felt this would ensure that God's favor would be upon them, and that the battle would go in their favor. God would fight for them. All the right boxes of protocol were checked off, and that everything would be right, and God would come through and fight their battles. So again, another very interesting thought process here of how they felt they needed to approach God, how they felt they needed to use the word appease. Maybe there's a lot of baggage from their previous understanding, and from pagan cultures and pagan rituals of God's having to be appeased, and trying to find favor with God, so that you give him what he wants, he gives you what you want. And so this is all coming into play, and you see that Saul is falling into this, I'll call it a trap of what religiosity was in those days, a succumbing to how they thought God worked, how they thought serving God and living for God and being a part of God's kingdom all worked together. And so Saul finally says, "Bring me a burnt offering and peace offerings," and he offered them. Now, again, look at the timing of this. He just finishes offering these burnt offerings, and guess who comes over the hill? It's Samuel. And I mean, it's almost laughable if you think of the timing of this. But what's interesting here is, most people will take this verse and say, oh, Saul stepped out of line. He offered burnt offerings. He took the role of the priest. This was his problem. This is why he got into trouble. But when we look ahead in the scriptures, we see that Saul really wasn't stepping out of his ability here because David did the same thing. David offered sacrifices. David went into the tabernacle of God and ate the showbread and went into the sanctuary. We see that Solomon later on offered many sacrifices in the temple, and they suffered no ill effect. They were not banished. They were not chastised. So there's got to be something deeper here than just what Saul did in the action of offering this sacrifice. So Samuel comes over the hill. Saul went out to meet him. This term meet, likratov, is really he went to encounter him in this Labarakov. Labarakov is a kind of a challenge. It wasn't just, coming and giving hugs and kisses and high fives and say, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here." This was more of Saul saying, "Well, where were you? Why did you do this to me? Why did you abandon me?" Saul was, from these words, we're going to see, if you look underneath this word to greet, you'll see it's a verb and it's in a PL form. This means it's a very intense. This is not just your happy, glad to see you, old friend. This is a in your face, strong, intensive as why weren't you here? I'm greeting you, but I'm seething, I'm boiling inside. I'm filled with emotion is what the PL form. And so, as you can imagine, Saul is not happy about this. He's not happy that people were deserting. He's not happy that Samuel was late. He's probably feeling guilty for what he did and jumped ahead, especially when as soon as he finishes, Samuel comes over the hill. Why did I not wait? So he's going to be on the defense. He's going to be on the try to have excuses to justify his behavior. All of this is going through Saul's mind right now. And of course, we don't know what other words were exchanged, but we do know the important ones here. So we get to verse 11, and Samuel says to Saul, Asita vayomer. What have you done? Me asita vayomer. And what's so interesting is I'm doing a simultaneous study with another person who's helping with my Hebrew, and we're in Genesis, and we just finished the portion where Cain slew Abel, and he has his encounter with God, and God comes to him and says, "What have you done?" They are the exact same words here, me asita, as what God said to Cain, me asita, what have you done? Um, so it just jumps out at me that he could have chosen any other words, any other phraseology, but used the exact same thing. So it shows the accusative, the interrogative of how how forceful this was, and what a tense situation this was, on the same caliber of interaction, on the same caliber of disobedience as to what Cain did when he slew Abel and God encountered him. And so here Saul um, had many choices, just like Cain had many choices. Remember when God encountered Cain afterwards, Cain could have repented, could have said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. No one had ever been killed before. I didn't know that the action that I've taken would cause him to lose his life." Saul could have chosen this. Saul could have said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I just the people pressured me." He could have just taken responsibility, assumed responsibility, and maybe the outcome would have been different. But Saul took the same avenue that Cain took, of blame placing, of deflecting, of not wanting to own up to the responsibility, and he starts his story of why he did what he did. And Saul says, "Oh, the people were scattered. You were not here. It's your fault." It's your fault, Samuel. You didn't come within the appointed time. This sounds so familiar. This sounds like, Adam and Eve at the garden, the blame game they played. It's the blame game that Cain played. It's this human nature side of us that doesn't want to assume responsibility, doesn't want to take responsibility. And you're going to see, and I'm going to jump ahead here because there's going to be a comparison that comes up really quickly as to what happens here with Saul and how he loses his kingdom. And but look at ahead, and we all know the story of how David reacted when he was confronted with the sin of Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah the Hittite. He was confronted with it, and he said, "It's my fault. I'm the man. I'm the one to blame. I'm the one that needs punishment." And here's where you start to see the contrast and the comparison between Saul and David, and to why David was chosen, and some of the wording that's about to come up in the next few verses. I think this is the key aspect that we're looking for here is David assumed responsibility. David willingly would have um, given in or received his punishment, and he threw himself at the mercies of God. Saul did not do that. Saul went and tried to play the dance around game, tried to deflect, and tried to get out of the situation. And so, just a little bit of tidbit of information, because what David did in committing adultery with Bathsheba, with killing Uriah, numbering the people, um, all the things that David did, if you were to compare them from our point of view, would be much, much worse. Even Solomon, with worshiping idols and taking the foreign wives and the things that he did, God didn't pronounce the same punishment against either of them as he did Saul for doing what we would think is just an innocuous, very minor transgression. But the severity was so different. So keep that in mind as we go on. So he's placing blame, deflecting. He said that the Philistines are gathered together. And what's interesting here, remember, every name of city or person has a deeper meaning. And when you look at the word, it says the Philistines were gathered at Michmash. And when you look at that, the word for it means to be snared or netted, captured in a snare and ensnared in something. Um, so whether there was a real city that was named that, or whether that city name was put in here to give us this indication that Saul fell into a snare, that this whole situation was meant to test him and to somewhat to see if it could catch him, to see if it could ensnare him. And Saul walked right into the trap. Saul allowed himself to be ensnared, to be mishmashed, if you will. And sounds like some English word that fits so appropriately how many times we've been mishmashed in our life and ensnared. And so Saul and Samuel are talking, and he gives his excuse that the Philistines were going to come upon him, and he's saying, well, I can't go to battle because I didn't make my supplication to God. He uses the word Yahweh, which is the compassionate. So Saul is really saying, well, I have to go through this ritual. I have to, before I could encounter and get God's favor, I need to pacify him. I need to do um, this ritual that will ensure that God will be on my side. Again, you see where Saul's mind is at. He's just not thinking. He is not a man after God's own heart or mind, has no concept on what it truly means to have a relationship with God. He's still in the, I'll do this for you if you promise you do this for me. And again, it's the sad commentary of humankind. Of course, we're way too sophisticated and way too spiritual to ever do any of things like this on our own. And of course, I'm speaking sarcastically and a little facetiously because this is a lesson to us all that God does not want us to be in a I'll do this. I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back, type of situation. He's looking for something so much deeper. And we're going to see that as the lesson goes on with future studies when a new man, David, comes into play. And so he felt compelled to offer these burnt offerings. He wanted to make sure he got God's favor. He wanted to go through the right rituals. He wanted to make sure that everything was all the boxes were checked off, and that he could guarantee that God was going to come through to him. And Samuel gets to Saul and says, "No way, you've done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of Yahweh, your God." Again, the compassionate side of God that God was hoping to share with Saul, but Saul did not know how to enter into. What's interesting here is this commandment. You'll see it mentioned here, and when we finally finish in verse 14, nowhere in the previous verses does it give any indication of what this commandment was. This had to be something that happened between Samuel and Saul as God spoke to um, Samuel, or maybe he just spoke it to Saul. But what we don't see is explicitly what this commandment was. We know it wasn't just to wait the 7 days. There's something much deeper than that. And so he's saying, you have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your God as he commanded you. And the punishment here is the loss of the kingdom. His dynasty is forever um, taken away from him. And so this is what's really something, because you see what Saul is trying to say here is that his heart was not in the right place. The verses are saying that his heart was not in the right place, and that God couldn't establish his kingdom. His dynasty was denied because his heart was not in the right place. He followed his head and not his heart, even though his heart was telling him to seek after God. He could have prayed. He could have done so many things that would have been in an attempt to enhance his relationship with God, but he chose none of those. And so, verse 14, as we come to the conclusion of the study, he says, his kingdom will not continue, but God has already knew this would happen and seeking for a man after his own heart. And this is where we get into the next verses of looking for David. But to me, my thoughts are going to be focused around this last verse, a man after God's own heart. And we'll talk more about that in the next verses. And I pray that as this has become a prayer of mine, I pray that it becomes a prayer of yours, to search out what does it mean to fulfill this verse, that is Yahweh, as God is looking for a man after his own heart. How do I get there? How do I find that? How do I allow that to be me? How do I live this? How does this become a part of me, as it appears God is looking for? Will he find it in you? Will he find it in me? So God bless you all. Thank you so much for being a part of this class today. Pray that God will bless you, and look forward to sharing again with you next week. Bye-bye.